The old African focused his gaze right above Riley's eyes. Obasi called this a place of true seeing. And Master Riley started to hear voices coming from the tree. Who said that? Who said that? Master Riley, scared and confused, Master Riley looked around at all the slaves, and then he looked at the old African, put his gun away, and quickly ran back to the house where he draped all night until they fell asleep. For 2 days and nights, the old African stayed awake, putting herbs on the boy's wounds and brewing teas for him to drink. The rest of the time, he held the boy's soul in his hands, as if it was a baby, asking it to stay in this world a while longer. The old African would often think about his wife, Ola, and all her beauty. But he would also think about that night when they were awakened by tribes who had ambushed their village, taking captive most of the men, women, and adolescents. But babies and the majority of the elders were killed. The old African would remember being tied up to other men in the village, front to back, with ropes tied to their wrists and waists. He remembered looking over at Ola and seeing her kneeling over her dead parents. And as he looked around to see if he saw his parents, he saw what appeared to be his father. Jaja tried to move forward to run to Ola's side and to see if his father was okay, but he couldn't. When he moved, everyone moved, and they started to yell and to falter. Jaja let out a scream from the depths of his soul. He cried. He cried as much over his inability to hold his wife, as well as in anguish for their murdered loved ones. His mother was never seen again. So he held on to the hope that she must have escaped. The captors led the villagers on a walk through the forest for 3 days. Their captors never told them where they were going, and the villagers never knew where their captors came from or understood their tongue. The men and women were kept separate, so Jaja could only look at Ola, her skin as softly black as a crow's flight. They had known each other since they were children and always knew that they would marry, and they would have each other as long as there were stars in the sky. Jaja tried to use his power to push away the fear he saw in her eyes. If he did not do something, the fear would eventually trickle into her spirit and take her away from him. But he was only 19, too young to know how to save her spirit, especially when he had his own to tend to. Before too long, the path to the palm and coconut trees ended, and they emerged into a bright and harsh sunlight. Their ears were filled with the roaring of an angry water. They stumbled and they slipped on the hot sand beneath their feet as the captors pushed them further and further to the water's edge. They wondered, why? Why is this river so angry? But as they looked at the sheer size of it, oh, they knew this was no river. And as they looked out into the distance, they saw a very large house floating on the water. How was this possible? As they looked in fear. Oh, this must be where they're going to take us. And then they saw them. Mariputo! 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 They shouted as they pointed to the white man. Now their people had stories about Mariputo, the Lord of the dead, who was the color of bones. But in their stories, there was only one. But this was many. They knew for sure they would die now. Screams of terror abound as they tried desperately to escape from their ropes, but their captors had the advantage of spears, and they was not afraid to use them. When the white men reached them, they talked to the captors, handed them some beads, and they disappeared into the forest. The white men then cut their ropes, but immediately replaced them with iron shackles on their wrists, ankles, and necks, with iron chains linking one to the other by the hands and neck. They were told to sit, and other men came and ripped their clothes from their bodies. They began to cry out against their nakedness, and the men could only watch in anger as the lords stripped and fondled their wives, sisters, mothers, and daughters. Anger filled Jaja when one of the lords had ripped his clothes off of him. But when the Lord ripped the clothes off of Ndulu, the man behind Jaja, Ndulu bit into the man's wrist, and he would not let go. The Lord screamed in pain as blood quickly filled Ndulu's mouth and ran down his chin. The Lord reached into his pocket, pulled out a gun, and shot Ndulu in the head. Jaja found himself lying on top of Ndulu, so close so close, he heard his last gasp of life. The Lords unchained Ndulu from Jaja and dragged his body to the edge of the forest and left him there. When the Lords finally got order of the captives, they set them down and shaved their heads, men and women. And as their scalps burned and bled, their cries fell upon deaf ears. But when it came to Jaja, he kept his screams inside. He looked over at Ola, her head bowed and her arms crossed her chest as the Lords looked upon the women with lust. Then they were led to the water's edge, loaded onto the ship, inspected like livestock, fed, and shackled into the belly of the ship in small 3-foot holdings, tiers stacked high, 3 men to a 3-foot box. And one morning on the deck of the ship while they're washing themselves, Jaja and Obasi saw a lord fondling Ola. Jaja, filled with anger, moved towards him, only to be blocked by Obasi. Get out of my way. She needs me. I cannot. You must not, whispered Obasi. And then suddenly, there was a loud yell. Ola had bit the neck of the Lord who was fondling her. And as he tried to catch her, she slipped away and ran to the ship's edge. And without hesitation, she jumped. She jumped into the waters far below. Jaja, he ran to the edge of the ship, calling out Ola's name. And Ola, looking back, called out Jaja's name.